My son, water." I brought him water. Then I left the block for roll call. But I quickly turned back. I lay down on the upper bunk. The sick were allowed to stay in the block, so I would be sick. I didn't want to leave my father. All around me there was silence now, broken only by moaning. In front of the block, the SS were giving orders. An officer passed between the bunks. My father was pleading, "My son, water. I'm burning up. My insides." "Silence over there," barked the officer. "Eliezer," continued my father, "water." The officer came closer and shouted to him to be silent. But my father did not hear. He continued to call me. The officer wielded his club and dealt him a violent blow to the head. I didn't move. I was afraid. My body was afraid of another blow, this time to my head. My father groaned once more. I heard, "Eliezer." I could see that he was still breathing in gasps. I didn't move. When I came down from my bunk after roll call, I could see his lips trembling. He was murmuring something. I remained more than an hour leaning over him, looking at him, etching his bloody, broken face into my mind. Then I had to go to sleep. I climbed into my bunk above my father, who was still alive. The date was January 28th, 1945. I woke up at dawn on January 29th. On my father's cot, there lay another sick person. They must have taken him away before daybreak and taken him to the crematorium. Perhaps he was still breathing. No prayers were said over his tomb. No candle lit in his memory. His last word had been my name. He had called out to me, and I had not answered. I did not weep, and it pained me that I could not weep. But I was out of tears, and deep inside me, if I could have searched the recesses of my feeble conscience, I might have found something like free at last. A few days before the Poles left, I had a novel experience. It was on a Sunday morning. Our commando was not required to work that day. Only Edek would not hear of staying in the camp. We had to go to the depot. This sudden enthusiasm for work astonished us. At the depot, Edek entrusted us to Freinek, saying, "Do what you like, but do something, or else you'll hear from me." And he disappeared. We didn't know what to do. Tired of huddling on the ground, we each took turns strolling through the warehouse in the hope of finding something, a piece of bread, perhaps, that a civilian might have forgotten there. When I reached the back of the building, I heard sounds coming from a small adjoining room. I moved closer and had a glimpse of Edek and a young Polish girl half naked on a straw mat. Now I understood why Edek refused to leave us in the camp. He moved 100 prisoners so that he could copulate with this girl. It struck me as terribly funny, and I burst out laughing. Edek jumped, turned, and saw me while the girl tried to cover her breasts. I wanted to run away, but my feet were nailed to the floor. Edek grabbed me by the throat. Hissing at me, he threatened, "Just you wait, kid. You will see what it costs to leave your work. You'll pay for this later. And now go back to your place." One day, when we had just returned from the warehouse, I was summoned by the block secretary. "A7713? That's me. After your meal, you'll go to see the dentist." "But I don't have a toothache." "After your meal, without fail." I went to the infirmary block. Some 20 prisoners were waiting in line at the entrance. It didn't take long to learn the reason for our summons. Our gold teeth were to be extracted. The dentist, a Jew from Czechoslovakia, had a face not unlike a death mask. When he opened his mouth, one had a ghastly vision of yellow, rotten teeth. Seated in the chair, I asked meekly, "What are you going to do, sir?" "I shall remove your gold crown, that's all," he said, clearly indifferent. I thought of pretending to be sick. "Couldn't you wait a few days, sir? I don't feel well. I have a fever." He wrinkled his brow, thought for a moment, and took my pulse. "All right, son, come back to see me when you feel better. But don't wait for me to call you." I went back to see him a week later. With the same excuse, I still was not feeling better. He did not seem surprised, and I don't know whether he believed me, yet he most likely was pleased that I had come back on my own, as I had promised. He granted me a further delay. A few days after my visit, the dentist's office was shut down. He had been thrown into prison and was about to be hanged. It appeared that he had been dealing in the prisoner's gold teeth for his own benefit. I felt no pity for him. In fact, I was pleased with what was happening to him. My gold crown was safe. It could be useful to me one day, to buy something, some bread or even time to live. At that moment in time, all that mattered to me was my daily bowl of soup, my crust of stale bread. The bread, the soup, those were my entire life. I was nothing but a body, perhaps even less, a famished stomach. The stomach alone was measuring time. There was a woman among us, a certain Mrs. Schechter. She was in her 50s, and her 10-year-old son was with her, crouched in a corner. Her husband and 2 older sons had been deported with the first transport by mistake. The separation had totally shattered her. I knew her well. A quiet, tense woman with piercing eyes. She had been a frequent guest in our house. Her husband was a pious man who spent most of his days and nights in the house of study. It was she who supported the family. Mrs. Schechter had lost her mind. On the first day of the journey, she had already begun to moan. She kept asking why she had been separated from her family. Later, her sobs and screams became hysterical. On the 3rd night, as we were sleeping, some of us sitting, huddled against each other, some of us standing, a piercing cry broke the silence. "Fire! I see a fire! I see a fire!" There was a moment of panic. Who had screamed? It was Mrs. Schechter. Standing in the middle of the car, in the faint light filtering through the windows, she looked like a withered tree in a field of wheat. She was howling, pointing through the window. Look at this fire! This terrible fire! Have mercy on me!" Some pressed against the bars to see. There was nothing, only the darkness of night. It took us a long time to recover from this harsh awakening. We were still trembling, and with every screech of the wheels, we felt the abyss opening beneath us. Unable to still our anguish, we tried to reassure each other. "She is mad, poor woman." Someone had placed a damp rag on her forehead, but she nevertheless continued to scream, "Fire! I see a fire!" Her little boy was crying, clinging to her skirt, trying to hold her hand. "It's nothing, Mother. There's nothing there. Please sit down." He pained me even more than did his mother's cries. Some of the women tried to calm her. "You'll see, you'll find your husband and sons again in a few days." She continued to scream and sob fitfully. "Jews, listen to me," she cried. "I see a fire. I see flames, huge flames." It was as though she were possessed by some evil spirit. We tried to reason with her, more to calm ourselves, to catch our breath than to soothe her. "She is hallucinating because she is thirsty, poor woman. That's why she speaks of flames devouring her." But it was all in vain. Our terror could no longer be contained. Our nerves had reached a breaking point. Our very skin was aching. It was as though madness had infected all of us. We gave up. A few young men forced her to sit down, then bound and gagged her. Silence fell again. The small boy sat next to his mother, crying. I started to breathe normally again as I listened to the rhythmic pounding of the wheels on the tracks as the train raced through the night. We could begin to doze again, to rest, to dream. And so an hour or two passed. Another scream jolted us. The woman had broken free of her bonds and was shouting louder than before, "Look at the fire! Look at the flames! Flames everywhere!" Once again the young men bound and gagged her. When they actually struck her, people shouted their approval. "Keep her quiet! Make that madwoman shut up! She's not the only one here!" She received several blows to the head, blows that could have been lethal. Her son was clinging desperately to her, not uttering a word. He was no longer crying.
Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of Night by Elie Wiesel, translated from the French by Marion Wiesel. Narrated by George Guidel. This recording is copyrighted 2006 by Recorded Books and directed by Natanya Johnson. In this terrifying account of the horror that was the Nazis' final solution, a young Jewish boy is turned into an agonized witness to the death of his family, the death of his innocence, and the death of his God. First published in French in 1958, Night is one of the great works of Holocaust literature by one of its foremost survivors. Winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, the author of over 30 books, and chairman of President Reagan's Commission on the Holocaust, Elie Wiesel has dedicated his life, as one observer has remarked, to being a messenger from the Jewish dead to the living. In his own words, to remain silent and indifferent is the greatest sin of all. With his writing and his tireless work as an activist and commentator, Wiesel has made an extraordinary contribution toward keeping the memory of this unimaginable atrocity alive, and toward making sure that it never happens again. And now, Night.
Evenings, as we lay on our cots, we sometimes tried to sing a few Hasidic melodies. Akiba Drummer would break our hearts with his deep, grave voice. Some of the men spoke of God, his mysterious ways, the sins of the Jewish people, and the redemption to come. As for me, I had ceased to pray. I concurred with Job. I was not denying his existence, but I doubted his absolute justice. Akiba Drummer said, God is testing us. He wants to see whether we are capable of overcoming our base instincts, of killing the Satan within ourselves. We have no right to despair. And if he punishes us mercilessly, it is a sign that he loves us that much more. Hirsch Ginud, well versed in Kabbalah, spoke of the end of the world and the coming of the Messiah. From time to time, in the middle of all that talk, a thought crossed my mind. Where is Mother right now? And Tzipporah? Mother is still a young woman, my father once said. She must be in a labor camp. And Tzipporah, she's a big girl now. She too must be in a camp. How we would have liked to believe that. We pretended. For what if one of us still did believe? First impression, better than Birkenau. Cement buildings with 2 stories rather than wooden barracks. Little gardens here and there. We were led toward one of those blocks. Seated on the ground by the entrance, we began to wait again. From time to time, somebody was allowed to go in, these with the showers, a compulsory routine. Going from one camp to the other several times a day, we had each time to go through them. After the hot shower, we stood shivering in the darkness. Our clothes had been left behind. We had been promised other clothes. Around midnight, we were told to run. "Faster!" yelled our guards. "The faster you run, the faster you'll get to go to sleep." After a few minutes of racing madly, we came to a new block. The man in charge was waiting. He was a young Pole who was smiling at us. He began to talk to us, and despite our weariness, we listened attentively. "Comrades, you are now in the concentration camp Auschwitz. Ahead of you lies a long road paved with suffering. Don't lose hope. You have already eluded the worst danger, the selection. Therefore, muster your strength and keep your faith. We shall all see the day of liberation. Have faith in life, 1,000 times faith. By driving out despair, you will move away from death. Hell does not last forever. And now, here is a prayer, or rather, a piece of advice. Let there be camaraderie among you. We are all brothers and share the same fate. The same smoke hovers over all our heads. Help each other. That is the only way to survive. And now, enough said. You are tired. Listen, you are in Block 17. I am responsible for keeping order here. Anyone with a complaint may come to see me. That is all. Go to sleep. 2 people to a bunk. Good night. Those were the first human words. Many years later, in Paris, I sat in the metro, reading my newspaper. Across the aisle, a beautiful woman with dark hair and dreamy eyes. I had seen those eyes before. Madame, don't you recognize me? I don't know you, sir. In 1944, you were in Poland, in Buna, weren't you? Yes, but you worked in a depot, a warehouse for electrical parts. Yes, she said, looking troubled, and then, after a moment of silence, wait, I do remember. Edek the Capo, the young Jewish boy, your sweet words. We left the metro together and sat down at a cafe terrace. We spent the whole evening reminiscing. Before parting, I said, "May I ask one more question?" I know what it is. Am I Jewish? Yes, I am. From an observant family. During the occupation, I had false papers and passed as Aryan. And that was how I was assigned to a forced labor unit. When they deported me to Germany, I eluded being sent to a concentration camp. At the depot, nobody knew that I spoke German. It would have aroused suspicion. It was imprudent of me to say those few words to you, but I knew that you would not betray me. They called him Moshe the Beadle, as if his entire life he had never had a surname. He was the jack of all trades in a Hasidic house of prayer, a shtibel. The Jews of Siget, the little town in Transylvania where I spent my childhood, were fond of him. He was poor and lived in utter penury. As a rule, our townspeople, while they did help the needy, did not particularly like them. Moshe the Beadle was the exception. He stayed out of people's way. His presence bothered no one. He had mastered the art of rendering himself insignificant, invisible. Physically, he was as awkward as a clown. His waif-like shyness made people smile. As for me, I liked his wide, dreamy eyes gazing off into the distance. He spoke little. He sang, or rather, he chanted, and the few snatches I caught here and there spoke of divine suffering, of the Shekhinah in exile, where, according to Kabbalah, it awaits its redemption linked to that of man. I met him in 1941. I was almost 13 and deeply observant. By day I studied Talmud, and by night I would run to the synagogue to weep over the destruction of the temple. One day I asked my father to find me a master who could guide me in my studies of Kabbalah. You are too young for that. Maimonides tells us that one must be 30 before venturing into the world of mysticism, a world fraught with peril. First you must study the basic subjects, those you are able to comprehend. My father was a cultured man, rather unsentimental. He rarely displayed his feelings, not even within his family, and was more involved with the welfare of others than with that of his own kin. The Jewish community of Siget held him in highest esteem. His advice on public and even private matters was frequently sought. There were 4 of us children, Hilda, the eldest, then Bee, I was the third, and the only son, Tzipora, was the youngest. My parents ran a store. Hilda and Bee helped with the work. As for me, my place was in the house of study, or so they said. There are no Kabbalists in Siget, my father would often tell me. He wanted to drive the idea of studying Kabbalah from my mind. In vain. I succeeded on my own in finding a master for myself in the person of Moshe the Beadle. He had watched me one day as I prayed at dusk. "Why do you cry when you pray?" he asked, as though he knew me well. "I don't know," I answered, troubled. I had never asked myself that question. I cried because something inside me felt the need to cry. That was all I knew. "Why do you pray?" he asked after a moment. Why did I pray? Strange question. Why did I live? Why did I breathe? "I don't know," I told him, even more troubled and ill at ease. "I don't know." From that day on, I saw him often. He explained to me with great emphasis that every question possessed a power that was lost in the answer. Man comes closer to God through the questions he asks him, he liked to say. Therein lies true dialogue. Man asks and God replies. But we don't understand his replies. We cannot understand them, because they dwell in the depths of our souls and remain there until we die. The real answers, Eliezer, you will find only within yourself. "And why do you pray, Moshe?" I asked him. "I pray to the God within me for the strength to ask him the real questions." The SS officers left. The block Älteste appeared, his face reflecting our collective weariness. "It all went well. Don't worry. Nothing will happen to anyone. Not to anyone." He was still trying to smile. The poor, emaciated Jew questioned him anxiously, his voice trembling. "But, sir, they did write me down." At that, the block Älteste vented his anger. "What, someone refused to take his word? What is it now? Perhaps you think I'm lying? I'm telling you once and for all, nothing will happen to you. Nothing. You just like to wallow in your despair, you fools." The bell rang, signaling that the selection had ended in the entire camp. With all my strength, I began to race toward Block 36. Midway, I met my father. He came toward me. "So, did you pass?" "Yes, and you?" "Also." We were able to breathe again. My father had a present for me. A half ration of bread, bartered for something he had found at the depot, a piece of rubber that could be used to repair a shoe. The bell. It was already time to part, to go to bed. The bell regulated everything. It gave me orders, and I executed them blindly. I hated that bell. Whenever I happened to dream of a better world, I imagined a universe without a bell.
On the last day of the Jewish year, the child is present at the solemn ceremony of Rosh Hashanah. He hears thousands of slaves cry out in unison, "Blessed be the Almighty." Not so long ago, he too would have knelt down, and with such worship, such awe, such love. But this day, he does not kneel. He stands. The human creature, humiliated and offended in ways that are inconceivable to the mind or the heart, defies the blind and deaf divinity. I no longer pleaded for anything. I was no longer able to lament. On the contrary, I felt very strong. I was the accuser, God the accused. My eyes had opened